It's
good for you.
Yeah, it's a very transformative environment. They are really politically active.
Yeah, so I hear.
Yeah, they still are. I'm amazed at them.
We should all go there to see
Yes.
what's insurgent planning for real.
Yeah, I'm actually not collaborating with the movements formally. I'm hired by the municipality, that the university were hired by the municipality, but the movements are so strong that it's so easier for us to work, empower the movements and then change things. It's been a nice experience.
Guys, I guess we already kind of started the discussion, which is amazing. But I'm very, very happy that everybody is here. It's 6:03 here in the Netherlands. We have a very sunny day here for a change. But good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to the launch of the book, Insurgent Planning Practice. We are delighted to have you all here online. Please be advised that we are recording this presentation. And well, you can always kind of, don't turn on your camera if you don't want to be seen. But yeah. Tonight we have an exciting program lined up featuring insightful presentations from our contributors. But before that, we have a talk by Professor James Holston from the University of California in Berkeley, but he will be announced a little bit later. I would like to introduce ourselves. We are the editors of the book Insurgent Planning Practice, published by Agenda Publishing. It's a very progressive publisher in the UK. I am Roberto Rocco from TU Delft, and I think you can see on your screen Gabriel Silvestre from Newcastle University in the UK. He will talk to you a bit later. We are very, very happy to present this book, Insurgent Planning Practice. It took years to complete. It explores cases in 10 cities around the world, showcasing how planners can change technocratic approaches by incorporating participation, inclusion, trans-sectionality, and the right to the city into their daily practices. As I said before, my name is Roberto Rocco. I'm an associate professor of spatial planning and strategy at TU Delft in the Netherlands. And my research focuses on the governance of sustainability transitions with a special attention to social sustainability and spatial justice. Gabriel.
All right. Thank you, Roberto. So, yeah, and I'm Gabriel Silvestre. I am a senior lecturer at Newcastle University in the UK, and I'm interested in the topics of urban governance, politics, social movements, and right to the city. So, in this book, we framed, in this publication, the book is framed as daily practice of radical planners who strive to democratize urban planning and to counter neoliberal governance. So in the book, we have a foreword by Professor Faranak Miraftab from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and who I think we're all indebted for the theoretical framework of insurgent planning. So for the purpose of this talk, I think it's also helpful for us to revisit some of the definitions that she provided in her seminal, I think, 2009 paper, where insurgent planning is presented as radical planning practice that respond to the neoliberal specifics of dominance through inclusion. It characterized the guiding principles of insurgent planning practice as counter-hegemonic, transgressive, and imaginative. So based on this, with this underpinning idea, so she interrogates the role of citizen participation in governance and examines the connection between neoliberal inclusion and insurgent citizenship. And she reminds us, and here I quote again, that neoliberalism should be understood as not simply a bundle of economic policies that extract capital, but as a network of policies, ideologies, values, and rationalities that work together to achieve capital's hegemonic power. So in the book, it is exactly this kind of hegemonic power that we're interested in. And we focus especially specifically on the let's say, in the field of practice of spatial planning. So I'll just talk briefly about how the book is organized. So as Roberto mentioned, we have 11 chapters. So 11 chapters, we have 10 different countries. One particular city features twice. And it is organized in 3 different parts. So in part 1, which is titled Political and Citizenship Practice, we have 4 chapters where the focus is on citizen action. In this case, meaning initiatives that are coming from civil society. In part 2, titled Academic Action, there are 3 chapters focusing on the role of academia and academics as agents of change. And I think Roberto is going to put some slides there. Roberto, is that right? Okay, so I think it might be easier to see how the book is structured.
I'm trying, but it's not so easy here. Wait a minute. Can you see it?
Yeah, I think looks good. It's just, yeah, it's okay. It's just showing what is the next slide as well. Right, so I was talking about part 2, which is focused on academic action. So it's not only about how, for instance, extension programs and planners and students collaborate with other organizations, but also from the university, how it can also scholars be agents of change. And then, okay, oh, good. Now I can see really well. Thanks, Roberto. So finally, we have part 3, titled Planning Practice. And in this, we have 4 chapters that look at how practitioners are trying to promote positive change and insurgent transformation. And practitioners not restricted only to those working in the public sector, but also from the private. Also, as for in particular case, we have a narrative of counselors that also try to make some positive changes from within. So this is it, Roberto. I think I'll hand over to you.
You give me a minute because now, of course, everything is out of place here. All right.
Do you want me? Okay. If you want, I can share from my side as well to make it easier.
No, that's fine. You don't need to share. We have a very long list of chapters, so we calculated, and it would be too long even to read the chapters for you. So I ask you to please, Gabriel, if you could put the link on the chat, people can go to the page on the agenda publisher, and they can see our 10 chapters. Today, we have with us Professor James Holston, who is the other person who provides a lot of the theoretical framework for this book via the notion of insurgent citizenship. His talk will be followed by pitches from 5 of the contributors to the book, who will be introduced as before they speak. And then Professor Clarissa Freitas from the Federal University of Ceará in Brazil will comment friendly on the pitches and on the contributions. So yeah, I think we hope this work will inspire some debate on the character of insurgency in planning, and well, to feed into our critical discourse about planning. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor James Holston from University of California, Berkeley. James is a political anthropologist whose research investigates the city as a strategic site for the emergence and erosion of citizenship, popular sovereignty, and democracy. He has conducted fieldwork projects in Brazil, Denmark, Nicaragua, and the United States, of course. His current research focuses on several areas: new forms and problems of democratic association, community-based entomology, insurgent cities, and urban citizenships, associational life in Danish cities in the wake of COVID-19, and the development of application software at the Social Apps Lab. Well, let's welcome Professor Holston. James, the floor is yours. I don't know if you want to share your presentation or you just want to...
Well, of course I'm going to share. I want to begin by thanking, well, first I want to begin by congratulating you on a brilliant intervention in the field of planning. It's just such a pleasure to see this book. I'm sure that it's going to become a beacon for guiding planners and activists to identify and deploy insurgent practices. So congratulations. It's a great achievement.
Thank you.
And I'm also want to thank you. I want to thank the organizers, Roberto and Gabriel, for including me in this celebration. I'm feeling especially honored to be included, and thanks for incorporating some of the concepts that I've developed over the years at the base of your studies and practices. Particularly insurgent citizenship, insurgent urbanism, disjunctive democracy. Some of these concepts and the fieldwork and the empirical cases on which they were based are in here. So I'm very pleased and delighted to be with you today. Roberto asked me to give some brief comments about insurgent citizenship. I think I'll take about 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes, he asked. And let me make some remarks about the concept of insurgent citizenship and highlight some of the ways that the chapters in your book engage insurgent citizenship and planning, and then return to the concept at the end. So let us think of insurgent citizenship. Let me just start also by saying, of course, I'm an anthropologist, not a planner, although I did go to architecture school and flirted with the idea, or more than flirted, and thought about becoming a planner. But I realized that I was a better anthropologist than a planner. And so I stuck with anthropology. But I've had an abiding interest in architecture and planning, and I think you've picked up on that. And I'm really very grateful for that. It's just fantastic to have readers. So let's think about insurgent citizenship, not only as a disrupting of established formulas of privilege, inequality, and rule, whatever these occur, be they state or private sector attributes, or a political party or a soccer club. Insurgent citizenship is certainly a counter, an opposition, a denial, subversion, negation, challenge, refashioning, repurposing of such forms and functions and formulas of rule. But I want to also suggest here that insurgent citizenship occurs as what we might call an unexpected commoning of people's actions and speech among other differences. That is, it also happens when people recognize each other as equals in the interval of other differences for the purposes of making something, whatever that might be. When they create a space of equality for that purpose in the sea of differences people normally bear in other realms of life, especially those of class and race and gender and education. So I'm speaking here of a kind of Arendtian political realm where people are in principle free from or much less burdened by these differences. And principles are vitally important in politics. So in this space of intervals, as we might call it following Hannah Arendt, political freedom disrupts the normally taken for granted differentials of everyday life. And this is not to say that the political, understood in this way, it does not harbor its own differentials, but in this formulation, they are managed in their own terms, sui generis. So what I've just described is the force of democracy's insurgent impact on citizenship, a blast from the outside of a particular regime of citizenship that overturns and erodes its legalized inequalities, such as a mass action to halt an eviction, right? A classic example. But also, it may be a blast from inside a regime of citizenship that emerges from within opportunities or platforms for planning something to happen that is common to different kinds of citizens. In both ways, the historical experience of active democratic citizenship demonstrates its inherently insurgent powers to disrupt norms of inequality and difference that define most citizenships as regimes of inequality and difference. I mean, that's what citizenships mostly are, mechanisms to distribute inequality, right? We can't romanticize that they're mechanisms to distribute equality. Mostly they distribute inequality and legalize privilege. So in both ways, insurgent citizenship demonstrates this inherently insurgent power of democracy to disrupt citizenship. So the kind of insurgents we're interested here, and it's not the only kind, of course, but the kind that we're interested in is a fundamental means to democratize citizenship, to keep its democratic components vital. And I want to return to this point in the conclusion. So the chapters of the book offer a forceful demonstration of the power of insurgent planning to disrupt, especially as it presses on state institutions from the outside. The chapters focus on the agencies of ordinary citizens, often allied with some planning professionals and academics, and often organized into grassroots and marginalized movements to perform actions that disrupt the policies and practices of experts and officials. So they demonstrate beautifully the efficacy of the counter-hegemonic practices of both individuals and organizations that challenge processes of neighborhood development and housing, for example, through rights claiming and space making. They do so even when they fail, as when the state or private security forces repress them through violence or co-opt them through buyouts and resettlement offers. And many of the chapters demonstrate this kind of mixed results. We see in these forceful case studies several important paradoxes, what I would call paradoxes and disjunctions of insurgent citizenship. Let me just discuss a few or list a few of these disjunctions and paradoxes. That citizenship changes as new people emerge to advance claims, expanding its realm, and as new forms of segregation and violence counter these advances, eroding it. So one of the paradoxes of insurgent citizenship is this shuttling between expansion and erosion. Another is that participation in the planning process stabilizes certain aspects of the state, especially the neoliberal state, even as it overturns others. A third that these chapters demonstrate is that insurgent citizenship reinforces certain kinds of domination of elites, technocrats, and experts, even as it makes room for the rights of non-elites in different kinds of knowledge production. Another is that insurgent citizenship may force the creation of new arenas for ordinary citizens to participate in planning assessments. But often, this participation is consultative only, without binding powers. And that seems to me a fundamental problem. As the case studies of the book demonstrate, it is important to emphasize that sites of insurgent citizenship are typically found where? Well, I would say at the intersection of these processes of expansion and erosion, these instances of paradox and disjunction. Now, neoliberalism may certainly exacerbate the contradictions of inclusion and exclusion, but it also provides new sites for insurgents. Now, although many of the chapters register the failures of planning practices, defeats that sting, defeats that may become discouraging as they become obvious to practitioners and participants, they also reveal these failures, that hegemonies and counter-hegemonies are never complete. The disjunctions also become new sites new opportunities for insurgent action. And showing that insurgent planning practices predictably produce this dialectic of citizenship is one, I think, of the most important contributions of the volume. So let's now take a broader look, a broader view at this dialectic, which the chapters bring forcefully into focus. Along with other studies, they lead us to consider two sets of problems that insurgent citizenship and practice produce. And here I'm going to go a bit big, I think, because the chapters evoke that reflection in me. So the first set of problems concerns the constitution and exercise of the supreme authority of the people, of popular sovereignty, of popular democratic sovereignty. So what I was thinking is that if democracy means rule of the people, what exactly does it mean for the people to rule in a constitution for government? And correlatively, can the multitude remain sovereign? Can it remain sovereign in a meaningful way, even when most people delegate the political powers of their citizenship to others and never actually govern? And I think that insurgent citizenship brings this problem of sovereignty into focus because it demands an accounting of this very problem. Now, it also reveals a second set of concerns. And this concerns the historical force of democracy to transform the political by disrupting entrenched powers and legalized inequalities. My argument is that democracy's critique of the constitution of political community lies in its imminent and insurgent faculty to disrupt it, to problematize citizenship and destabilize its differentiations. For this second concern, the case studies in the volume corroborated an important conclusion of my own ethnographic and historical studies of Brazilian citizenship. I argued that in the development of the poor peripheries of Brazilian cities, the historical sites of citizen differentiation, restricted political rights, limited access to land, illegality as the norm of settlement, eviction, servility. These sites of citizen differentiation fuel the eruption of an insurgent citizenship among the working classes that destabilized and entrenched differentiated citizenship. So this problem of destabilization circles back to the first problem. If a key attribute of democratic citizenship is the capacity to subvert inequality, then it must somehow institutionalize disruption as a political resource to keep it vigorous, to democratize democracy consistently and durably. It must attain stability, but avoid becoming an entrenchment. I suggest that these sets of provocations democratize citizenship, inciting it with problems of sovereignty and government, equalization and differentiation, disruption and institutionalization. I also propose that in a democracy, there is no resolution of these problems. That's the point. Their tensions are necessary to mobilize democracy. And attempts to resolve them, such as representative democracy, which is always presented as a resolution, or neoliberal participation. These attempts destroy democracy's energy and fundamentally betray it. So these arguments lead us to conclude that if we understand citizenship as membership in a political community, then it becomes democratic when provoked to confront problems of sovereignty and government, equalization, differentiation, disruption, and stability. In other words, what makes democratic citizenship democratic is the critique of the constitution of the political that these problems force into the open. The democratic component is precisely the insurgent faculty of democracy to transform the political through this exposure. Anti-democrats resist this engagement, proposing conceptions of the political that indicate a resolution to these problems of sovereignty, equality, and institutionalization. That is what neoliberalism does with its veneer of inclusion and public-private partnerships. But democracy's disruptions are especially forceful because they are unfinished, unresolved, insurgent incitements to erode entrenchments of power and destabilize inequality. They unsettle, provoke, probe, transform. To those in power, insurgent citizenship is an intolerable intrusion into established ways of doing politics. To those without a share, it is revolutionary. So, to summarize, if democracy's aptitude is to problematize citizenship, then the popular sovereignty and its citizen practices that establish democracy's rule must incorporate disruption, what we have here called insurgents, as a political resource to keep democratic citizenship vitalized, to democratize democracy persistently. In other words, insurgent citizenship isn't some external component that blasts away at the edifice of the state. It has to be inside as well. Now, failure to do that is what Hannah Arendt identifies as the lost treasure of revolution. Do you know this wonderful last chapter in her book on revolution? It's called The Lost Treasure of Revolution. And she writes, and I quote, "The failure of post-revolutionary thought to remember the revolutionary spirit and to understand it conceptually was preceded by the failure of the revolution to provide it with a lasting institution. For the exercise of precisely those qualities which had been instrumental in building it." In other words, how to institutionalize a revolution. This impasse derives from the seemingly irreconcilable contradiction between popular sovereignty and government, she wrote, within the revolutionary spirit itself. Namely, that at the foundation of a revolution, the concern with durability of the new structures of government is entwined with what she wrote as the exhilarating awareness of the human capacity of beginning. But without institutionalizing the entanglement of disruption and stability post-revolution, which seems so difficult to do, right? So difficult to do that, to institutionalize this entanglement of disruption and stability. The contradiction between them hardens into opposition, and this opposition is itself among the symptoms of our loss. If we follow the lines of evidence and arguments presented in your volume of essays, it's not hard to conclude that what we have lost in the modern Republican and especially neoliberal nation state is the democratic component of citizenship. What we feel as a result, if we care, is betrayal and anger. However, this volume of essays, especially those I think in the third part on insurgents within the planning profession, the essays of this volume also lead me to consider the antidote of direct democracy. To ask, how might planning practices bring into being instances of direct democracy? By direct democracy, I mean the exercise of popular sovereignty through assemblies of citizens that embody both authority and government, without the delegation of either to bodies of selected professional experts based on notions of resemblance or authorization. The two being the theories of delegation. I do not mean non-deliberative plebiscites, something like Brexit. In assembly-based direct democracy, popular assemblies may be constituted in various ways. They can be in person, they can be virtual. The key point is that citizens themselves make decisions about issues affecting them that are binding on those deliberating, and not merely advisory to others who hold the power to accept or to reject. Thus, so-called participatory democracy, right, especially as it flourished in Latin America, is mostly not direct, and mostly, as a result, deeply frustrating. The founders of Republican and liberal forms of political constitution reject democratic government in its direct assembly-based form as a model for large territorial nation states. Since at least the 18th century, they reiterate the same set of criticisms, often derived from Aristotle's Politics, right? So what are these criticisms? The supposed incompetence of the masses to rule due to their ignorance and irrationality, their lack of time and money to devote to government, the impossibility of gathering large populations into face-to-face assemblies, and the spectacles of turbulence, as James Madison put it in the build-up to the US Constitution, that led direct democracies to short lives and violent deaths. And these are the classic criticisms of the direct democratic practices. Instead, they advocate the liberal Republican as antidote to the democratic. While I have no time for elaboration, it is important to observe that the founders of modern liberal Republican forms, I'm thinking of the line from Hobbes and Rousseau and Condorcet and Madison, to do so, primarily, they did this. They presented the liberal Republican as the antidote to the democratic through two conceptual innovations. They distinguished sovereignty from government, right? Hobbes' classic contribution, so that, for example, the people could retain its sovereignty through plebiscites about fundamental laws, but not participate in either their deliberation or administration. That was the fundamental insight. And they developed schemes of representation through the delegation of authority to professional experts based on notions of resemblance, kind of representing of the likeness, right? The likeness of the people in an elected parliament, or authorization through ratification of charters. So these Republican innovations restrict popular sovereignty to occasional non-deliberative plebiscites and assign government to small parliamentary bodies of selected experts. The latter are legitimated by one theory of representation or another and allow the assembled people no institutional role. In such ways, liberal Republican government intends to counteract the supposed chaos, incompetence, and threat of democracy, direct democracy by the multitude. So what I want to suggest is that to call this Republican liberal scheme of delegated government democracy is a travesty. Yet Republicans and liberals fear and reject the answers that direct democracy provides about democratic citizenship, that democracy destabilizes, in other words, entrenched power, privilege, and inequality, and that democratic rule depends on figuring out how to institutionalize this disruption as a reliable political resource for government in the interest of the masses. So both components of direct democracy subvert the oligarchic self-interests of liberal Republicans to govern by a few, in other words, the wealthy, without the assembled people to rule, in other words, undemocratically. They erode notions of the superiority of birth and of the best that elites espouse. The predicament of democracy is the institutionalization of this disruptive force. Etienne Balibar, makes a similar point. He writes, "It is not that we must throw out constitutions in favor of insurrections, but rather that we must place the insurrectional, what I call the insurgent, power, the insurgent power to emancipate at the core of political constitutions." The question is how? How does the multitude exercise its sovereignty to retain the insurgent elements of democracy and the resource of government? How does it institutionalize Hannah Arendt's spirit of revolution? It seems to me that this is the great challenge for insurgent planning practices. To see if and how such practices could create opportunities for direct democracy in contemporary cities, I've investigated over the years how classic direct democracy used various planning strategies to control office, limit entrenchments of political power, and undermine the privileges of biography. I found, for example, that they used methods of lottery, sortition, in other words, rotation in office, short-term limits, and accountability for competence, all perfectly viable today, both inside and adjacent to the state. Most important, assignment by lottery established the rule of equality by chance in the distribution of office. It determined not only that everyone among citizens could govern, but more outrageously for anti-democrats, that any one of them could govern. Sortition asserted the democratic confidence that anyone could become reasonably competent in office, at least for a short period of time. In all cases, direct democracy was most fully nourished by the equal right of citizens to attend and speak in assemblies, where decisions made by members are binding and not merely recommendations to higher authorities. These assemblies do not have to be about protest and head-on challenge. They can be about dengue prevention, about street cleanup, urban agriculture, collective childcare, lending libraries, ride sharing. They do not have to occur within the state apparatus. They are more efficient, in fact, if adjacent to it. The important point is that they figure and prefigure assemblages of citizens that embody kinds of common actions that disrupt entrenched inequalities, that positively enact a new imaginary for a democratic social world. So they do not have to transform state housing policy to be effective insurgent planning practices. Their imaginary can figure at a much smaller, local, and achievable scale that will probably not halt an eviction or stop police violence, but it may produce other results that demonstrate the competence of ordinary citizens to govern their own lives. And that seems to me to be an absolutely fundamental contribution of insurgent planning practices. The studies in this book provide us with many examples of head-on collisions with the neoliberal state. And no doubt, given the urgency of so many urban injustices, such confrontations will remain the prime focus of insurgent planning practices. But this brilliant volume also indicates that insurgent planning can produce a prefiguration of an alternative democratic imagination that emerges under the radar of state control and repression. That's a great place to be, under the radar of state control and repression. Such practices of insurgent citizenship can also show us how to disrupt the entrenchments of inequality, how to institutionalize, in other words, a regular, predictable, persistent, and reliable democratization of democracy. Thanks.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much. I recognized a lot of what you said in the chapters that were written. The idea that we have to be inside to be able to change is expressed in many of the chapters in which the insurgent planners kind of sneak in the corridors of power and change things from the inside. That's very, very important. And also the idea, yeah, you described many of the chapters quite well. We do have time for a few questions. So there is a question in the chat. I will try to put it in the chat again. Wait. Chat it. This is a question from Anshu Rai Sharma. In what ways do the everyday practices of insurgent citizenship align with Arendt's emphasis on the extraordinary nature of revolutionary action in reclaiming public freedom?
Well, I think that what she pointed to was the paradox of that extraordinary nature. So revolutions, of course, are extraordinary, but then they must institutionalize themselves in order to create durable structures of rule. And that's the problem. And she goes through many examples of how, in which they all fail. they all failed exactly to institutionalize the extraordinary nature of revolutionary action. And her argument was that it's precisely that institutionalization that has to happen in order to revitalize the structures of power when they become stale and overburdened. And we've not been able to do that. And so it's not, but I think it's not only that can occur within the corridors of power, as Roberto just suggested. I mean, certainly we can try there, but I do think that they can also occur adjacent to the state, adjacent to the private sector. I mean, we're living, for example, today in a period of epidemic dengue in Latin America, right? It's epidemic. And, the state just can't deal with it. But in fact, we did a project in Managua, in Nicaragua a couple of years ago, where we just organized brigades of young people to deal with standing water in their neighborhoods that had nothing to do with the state. And the numbers were amazing. The citizen entomology that resulted was extraordinary. I mean, you can organize, my experience in the urban peripheries of Sao Paulo with, neighborhood associations that organized to, put down asphalt, and, lighting. I mean, these were all amazing achievements in which people self-organized. And so that, I think, is a demonstration of competence and effectiveness that I think institutionalizes, you might say, the revolutionary spirit, because these are people who are excluded, and their inclusion in those kinds of processes is a revolution, is a disruption, at least, of the entrenchment of privilege. So, yeah.
Very good. I wonder if there are more questions from the audience. Gabriel or Clarissa, if you want to ask something.
Yeah, no, just saying that we might have time for just one question or one comment before we can also hear from the contributors. Clarissa, I think you have something you want to say?
Yeah, Professor James just pointed to a point that oftentimes you, Roberto, also points to this, look into this, as to what point self-organization of organized cities are disruptive. Because sometimes, especially in neoliberal times, where government is always in a position of putting responsibility on citizens and saying, okay, I don't have capacity to do that. So sometimes this discourse of participation is also bad. So if Professor James Holston could comment a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we see everywhere that neoliberalism rules the issue of devolution of government. So, I've been working in Denmark on these projects. I mean, Denmark is a place in which the formal housing associations of residents ruled and with the state as their partner in these mixed class public housing estates, and the governments and neoliberal governments have devolved that to the municipalities, which have in turn devolved that to the associations in a period of declining interest in these formal associations. So what's left? And I think that what we find is that actually people have lots of organizations and associations that are sometimes called leisure associations, football clubs, dance groups, art groups. We looked at one, the Turkish mothers kitchen, where people get together. Turkish mothers got together, these housing estates, to cook meals, and there's a tremendous amount of distributed knowledge here about what ordinary citizens can accomplish. And that, I think, is disruptive because it challenges the main dismissal of citizens as in being incompetent. That's been the main refrain over and over again to justify expertise and technical knowledge, is that the people are incompetent. Of course, it doesn't address the fact that experts are also incompetent, as we well know. But right. But that refrain, that constant refrain, 2,000 years of since Aristotle, of echoing this, that the people are incompetent, when it's countered by these organizations that emerge under the radar of the state and cities is fundamentally disruptive, because it demonstrates that the people are, in fact, quite competent. And that's a major achievement.
Thank you so very much. Look, I think we would have material and ideas to discuss until very late tonight. We are already a bit late with the program, so I want to thank you, Professor Holston, for being here and for sharing your knowledge with us and being so generous with your time. I know it's not easy with all these invitations to speak online all the time, so thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank you again for this invitation, and insurgent planning practices are really key to the sort of disruption, the institutionalization of disruption that I'm advocating. And it's also nice to see some old friends here. Ana Maria,
Yeah.
how are you?
Absolutely.
I can see some people that I haven't seen in a long time. So it's very nice to be here and to meet the new people. I'm going to stay on for a while, and then I have to leave to go to the airport.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I will hand over to Gabriel now, so we continue with our program.
Great. So yeah, just to reiterate, thanks so much, James, for this brilliant introduction to kick off our next speakers. So what we are going to do next is we have a selection of the many contributors to the book. We are very pleased and grateful for 5 of them to have accepted this invitation. And I would say also a challenge for them to summarize very briefly their own contributions in this book. So what we're going to do now is just to give you a glimpse of their contributions. So in order to help the understanding of each of these chapters, we presented 3 questions to them, and we thought that this could be a helpful way to organize and compare and see how each chapter is contributing to the literature on insurgent planning. So we asked 3 questions to the next speakers. So the first one is for them to explain what is the context in which the case is examined in your chapter. So just a very brief background of the context that you are examining. Second, what makes the experience an example of insurgent planning practice? And third, how does the chapter contribute to the insurgent planning literature? So the contexts are varied, and we're very pleased to have a very good mix of contributions here and of cases. So we'll kick off with Duygu Cihanger Ribeiro. Thanks so much for being here with us. So Duygu is an assistant professor of city and regional planning at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Turkey. And her expertise covers the areas of public space, street use and design, urban sociology, everyday life, and spontaneity in urban design. Duygu, I hope that I have covered well your expertise, and now I'd like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, and thank you for the event, and thanks to the participants. Good afternoon. I will try to really summarize the entire chapter in 5 minutes, hopefully. The chapter discusses the insurgent role of urban planners in the challenging institutional planning context of Turkey, with the case of Chamber of City Planners. Actually, it's a chamber that strives for a democratic practice in urban development in the given political climate in the country. Actually, the chapter title, Either They Want It or Not, belonged to the president of Turkey while he was referring to the debate around the Kanal Istanbul project. It was an idea to create an artificial canal. Maybe some of you already know. It's like a second Bosphorus connecting Black Sea to Marmara Sea. The chamber's opposition both to this project, the Kanal Istanbul project and Taksim project, led to Gezi Park protests, as you all know. They evolved through public petitions, press releases, and informative meetings to the public, and it created a nationwide reaction. And eventually, both projects have been cancelled or delayed. The Chamber of City Planners in Turkey is an interesting example because it's a formal institution established by a constitutional decree. So it's not like a grassroots organization. It operates, in fact, within a legal framework. But it has a critical role in advocating for participatory and democratic urban planning, which at times falls in the opposition of state urban planning practices. Instead of just focusing on the single institution, we wanted to give two key actors to better understand this struggle. They both belong to the chamber over the years. Their connection to the chamber starts from their university studentship. And I'm also a member of the chamber, and I'm also in the board of the chamber for many years, over a decade. The first name is Deniz Kimyon, an urban planner. She serves as a supervisor in the chamber and acted as a spokesperson. The key point to understand her role is that her academic career faced a lot of setbacks due to her political stance, including contract termination from her university and travel restrictions following her support for a peace petition alongside with many academics in the country. Tayfun Kahraman is an assistant professor of planning who played a crucial role as a spokesperson of Taksim Solidarity Platform during the Gezi Park protest. And he has been a key figure in Istanbul's municipal administration. Unfortunately, currently he is imprisoned for over 2 years due to his role that I just mentioned in the Gezi Park protest. So these individuals provide a close-up perspective on the intersection between individual power as urban planners and also group representation in an institutional setting, while chamber leverages its legitimate authority to advocate for the public good in political environments, which unfortunately dominated by a rather top-down and authoritarian decision-making processes. And what they do through chamber or through our through individual planners to create judicial actions and press releases and many trainings, educative trainings and events, workshops for planners and students. But there are some key members as Deniz and Tayfun to represent these insurgent actions. But it's very interesting to hear their story when we had the interviews with them, because they don't see insurgency or what they have done, which caused a lot of disruptions in their professional life, as an activism or as an act of rebel. They really see this as an integral part of an urban planning profession in the country. They define to fight for the right to the city and to fight for the public good is a must in the political climate of country. So our chapter basically, with this case, expands the insurgency literature to include institutional activism. And it challenges the notion that insurgent actions must occur outside formal institutions. I believe what Professor James Holston already mentioned this quite well. Still, the chamber's activities do not fit neatly into existing categories of institutional activism. But we believe that it rather acts on the institutional and non-institutional boundaries, because it also has this individual and group dynamic quite dialectic in one way. So in summary, the Chamber of City Planners in Turkey exemplifies an insurgent planning approach within an institutional context. They utilize judicial actions, public advocacy, and professional commitment. They challenge authoritarian urban planning practices, and they advocate for a more democratic approach in the country, and this struggle is continued through years. And fortunately today, the chamber faces continuous repression, it is portrayed in the public as an antagonistic to national interests by the ruling power. And this polarizing strategy aims to isolate and weaken the chamber's influence. Also, the practices of urban planning, as we have seen after the great earthquake of last year. And unfortunately, we are still witnessing through the imprisonment of Tayfun Kahraman, which contributed to this chapter by reflecting on his experience. So before taking more of your time and before concluding, we would like to salute Tayfun Kahraman and his family, Erich and Bera Kahraman, and express our solidarity with them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I'm always in awe of what you have accomplished, and but sometimes I have a problem getting the pronunciation of your name right. How do you pronounce your first name?
It's Duygu.
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 Yeah. Yeah, it's not so difficult after all. Thank you so much. I wonder if there are any questions. If not, maybe we can leave the questions for later, for the end. But now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Seppe de Blust. Seppe is a research coordinator at ETH Zurich, chair of urban transformation. He's also a partner of Endeavor. It's a young planning office in Belgium, an office for social spatial research. Seppe does research in urban planning, social innovation, planning theory, and collective learning. Seppe, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can I share my screen? Yes. Oops, the wrong. Yeah, okay. You see the website of Endeavor now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I used to be a partner. I'm now working in another office, but indeed I set it up Endeavor 10 years ago. And that's the topic of the case studies, the practice we're looking at. Endeavor is a collaboration between different young people in Flanders, Belgium, that started to respond to, let's say, more traditional planning practice, and mostly looked at the kind of the lack of a social agenda in urban policy and planning, and wanted to really put that back on the table. And I think what the article tries to do is to understand how this kind of more insurgent planning ambitions, how they indeed survive throughout setting up an office, throughout planning practice, and how you can organize yourself around it. And that's not an easy thing, of course, in a sense that you constantly have to navigate between the strategic and selective practices of others. You're not only setting your own normative plan, but it's always in negotiation, in coalition, or in opposition. And you try to trace mechanisms of exclusion while also collectively constructing possibilities for future action. And I think what the chapter tries to do is to more in detail look at how then the definition of insurgent planning also changes over time. It goes over several projects, and here on the website you already see several ways of organizing Endeavor. It goes over these several projects, and it uses a specific lens for that. It uses the definition of democratic, or three understandings of democratic politics for that. The first one, a more deliberative take on democracy. It started actually also with Endeavor, the idea of inclusion and more inclusive debate as one of the main ambitions of the coalition, but then also going into more agonistic democratic politics, or a view on politics where it's more the competition over power, that over time started to also become part of the projects of Endeavor. And a third one, very important, a more disruptive understanding of democratic politics, where it's more about introducing new kind of identities and agencies. And what the chapter does is showing how this choice of which kind of democratic, let's say, take to activate is often a reactive choice. It's often depending on with whom you collaborate. How much are you part of already an existing institutional coalition, or how much are you actually operating on the fringe and starting or trying to respond to certain conditions. So I think that's, let's say, on the second question, how is this an example of insurgent planning, is that the chapter, I think, really shows how that is very much defined by the context Endeavor is operating in, and how that negotiation influences also the definition of insurgent planning practice. And I think in a conclusion, and I think it relates also a bit to this about question, is that throughout the paper it shows that on the one hand, Endeavor has a certain mission, it has a certain type of practices, it's very much action, but at the other type, it's also an organization. It's a cooperative. It's through the trajectory of defining insurgent planning practice, also the way you organize yourself becomes as important, especially, and I think that relates to this institutional question that was raised before, especially that because of this organizational structure, it allows you to continuously create your own room of maneuver, and to understand also which democratic notion you can activate based on the status of discussion and also the different networks of power in play. And I think that's the contribution of this chapter, is that it very much tries to understand insurgent planning as the kind of the interplay between, on the one hand, the agency of here endeavor and the structural mechanisms that define the planning fields. That's an interesting perspective to also understand how democratic notions can be activated throughout time and our definition of insurgent planning shifts. In that sense, we put forward a more reflexive understanding of insurgent planning in and beyond the planning field, reflexive in a sense that the organizational structure and the way you activate it, the way you define it becomes one. There is an interplay between it, and there different questions become key. What are the power differences at play? How are they enforced by the different roles and instruments of planning practice? How does it affect the members' room of maneuver as critical spatial practitioners? Does this create enough of an equal basis to start from a deliberative understanding of democracy? Or is there the need or potential for a more disruptive or agonistic even perspective? And how can you then develop the right means to work from this position? I think that's what we try to describe in the chapter. It's a chapter also written by me, but then also together with Elisabeth van Wijmeers and Stan Oosterlink as more outsiders, critical spatial thinkers. And we based the chapter on data out of interviews with other members of Endeavour, but also collaborators, activists, people from civil society that worked with us in the past. And based on these interviews, we try to describe a bit the way we worked so far over the last 10 years.
Great, thanks so much, Seppe. Thank you. The chapters are really a great contribution to the discussion. And I just want to add that, as you have seen, we're looking at, well, the book looks at a range of different actors. So we already heard from Duygu, a professional association in the Turkish Chamber of Planners. Seppe is talking about Endeavour, which I understand also takes commercial projects, right, Seppe, as well as engage in more counter-hegemonic activities as well. But even if there's a wide range of actors, the focus on the book is really on the practice, right? So as the point that Faranak Miraftab really stresses in her foreword and in her own work, to say that the constitution of insurgency is on the practice itself. We have to focus on this because each context will vary and we cannot just generalize what is the general insurgent practice in general. It depends to what is the context that it is responding to, right? So, and we also cannot just take a very stable definition of an actor being insurgent. It also depends on the context that it is responding, the practice that it's employing as well. Thanks so much, Seppe. So now we are going to hear from our third contributor. So I just want to now introduce Christine Mady, who is a senior lecturer at the Aalto University in Finland. But between 2016 and 2020, she was the head of the Department of Architecture at the Notre Dame University, Ruiz in Lebanon. Please, Christine, correct me if I said it well. Okay, so her research covers literature on space production, relational perspectives, participatory processes, imaginaries, and urban mobility. And it explores various aspects and categories of public spaces, and this includes marketplaces, alternative spaces, and co-design spaces. So, Christine, thanks so much for being here. So I would like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel and Roberto. Thank you and everyone for joining this book launch. Can you just confirm that you hear me well? Because I am in Beirut and I just want to check that my connection is okay.
Yeah, the connection seems good. And thanks so much. I think you are on your annual leave. So I think we are very grateful for you for making time to...
No, it's a pleasure to be here, really. But before answering very briefly the 3 questions within the 5 minutes, I just want to indicate one important aspect about this chapter. And I think, Duygu, you also pointed to that in your chapter. I am one of 4 authors. And what joined us to write this chapter is that we had different relations with Nahnu, who are an NGO. And now I move to the first question, who are an NGO that emerged or were established post-civil war in Lebanon. The context is a post-war city, which is Beirut, Lebanon, which is living in a perpetual state of exception. And I think insurgent planning in this chapter was very much related to this perpetual state of exception, which means that laws are both followed but also disregarded on a case-by-case basis. The actors that are described or referred to in the chapter are members of the NGO Nahnu, and Nahnu in Arabic means we, which was essential to the establishment of this NGO, given that the Lebanese civic society was very much fragmented or further fragmented after the civil war. So Nahnu tried to overcome some wartime divides among the population through their insurgent planning, and specifically with a focus on youth, who are possibly the generation who can overcome that. For the second question, which is what is the experience of insurgent planning that is described in that chapter? Well, it is the process that Nahnu followed over the period of 7 years, or at least 7 years. And this has been documented in the chapter, of course, in detail. What was interesting about the insurgent planning process, which was the reopening of Beirut's largest pre-war park, which is a pine forest, is that Nahnu started by questioning the claims of the local authorities or the state for why this park has been closed after the civil war in 1975 and until its reopening in 2016. Nahnu followed different ways forward in order to open this park. And this was what was interesting about their insurgent planning acts. They tried to build support from civic society, civic organizations, non-governmental agencies, but they also challenged the authorities and tried to establish communication between the authorities and civic society. In addition, they tried to empower different actors in the vicinity of the park who were divided. Just a very quick caveat here. The park is located in the former demarcation line that separated Beirut into east and west with a segregated population. The chapter, however, ends with a caution that insurgent planning is not a standalone process. So we cannot overburden it and expect that insurgent planning can solve structural problems within a specific context, nor can it be considered as a solitary way of addressing public needs. And this is why we very much valued the temporal aspect of insurgent planning acts, that they represent a stage that allows us to rethink or to reconsider how insurgent planning can inform planning to actually or effectively match and respond to the needs within ever-growing uncertainty or instability, at least in the case of Lebanon. And one final sentence about that. It is really the diversity of tools, but also the evolution of the process that Nahnu followed throughout these 7 years and even before, to suit a specific spatio-temporal context, which was very much of value to insurgent planning processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thanks for being very concise and going straight to the point in your answers. I think Christine's chapter is a very clear example of really civil society taking issues in their own hands, while Duygu's chapter dealt with Chamber of Planning of Turkey. So insurgency from the very within. Seppe's chapter dealt with a young planning office in Belgium and gave us a glimpse of, okay, what could insurgents be from a private practice. Here we have a very clear example of insurgency coming from citizens. And I tend to agree with Christine, and this is a point that I raise very often. We can't only rely on insurgency. Structural changes need to happen as well. But my belief and my hope is that insurgency is the seed that grows and that also shows the way for others to follow, right? As I said, maybe we can keep the questions for the end. Thank you so much, Christine. But now I want to introduce my friend Erich Wolff, postdoctoral research fellow at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Are you there, Erich?
I am still based in Singapore, but currently I am in the UK. Just
okay, cool.
On
So
a
you're
trip.
closer than I thought. Well, his work critically reflects on the social, political, cultural, and economic dimensions of nature-based solutions for climate adaptation. He's currently investigating water-related issues through local perspectives, particularly in data-poor contexts disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. He's an enthusiast of citizen science as a tool to decentralize decision-making and engage non-scientists in knowledge production. And I think your chapter is a very good illustration of that. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Erich.
Thank you very much, Roberto and Gabriel and everyone. It's a great pleasure. I have a few images to share, but I'll try my best to be very brief. So I'm talking about chapter 8. This is a chapter that was developed throughout my doctoral studies. We were working in an amazing project which is called the Revitalizing Informal Settlements and Dire Environments. It's an action research project, so we're talking about an initiative that started within a research institution, and what we were doing is we needed data, and the best way of trying to collect data was partnering with people. That could be framed as traditional participatory research, but we wanted to investigate how we could make it go further and understand the potential for insurgency within citizen science, which is a growing trend in general. We see a lot of people talking about citizen science. And I think what motivates me is very often we see people overestimating what citizen science does as citizen science being transformative. And I feel that we need to be honest to the limits of this practice and how this practice can achieve more. So I think that's a lot of what we're talking about in this chapter. Just to give you a little bit of context, this is where we were working. This is the RISE program was working in Indonesia and Fiji, so in the Asia Pacific region, and trying to create a new model for nature-based wastewater treatment. So these are communities that really are in need for infrastructure, and it's what we would officially call the informal settlements as defined by the United Nations. So there is a need for new types of infrastructure or decentralized models that can better cater for the local needs, that can ensure that people's lives improve and people have access to sanitation, and we can reduce child mortality and we can reduce contamination levels. So this is the type of location we're seeing. Those are very flood-prone sites, and you can see there's a blue house at the bottom there. This is a photo from 2018, and this is a photo for after the construction of the infrastructure. So this is what we're talking about. This is a green wastewater treatment system, but the big challenge here is we don't know anything about this site. When a researcher arrives and wants to design here, you don't know what are the flood levels, you don't know how people use the site, you don't know what is the history of it. And that's one of the big challenges of how do we collect data. And obviously the most blatant answer is you work with people. People on the site know the answers, they know their sites better than anyone else. So citizen science becomes the obvious choice for how do we work, collaborate with communities to understand their needs and to design something that makes sense in each site. And then coming from a participatory planning background, the approach here was, can we create this framework to ask people to take photos of water levels? So we installed these gauges and asked, hey, can you help us taking photos every day when there's a flood so that we can map the water levels? So this is very traditional hydrology. It's not groundbreaking and by any means not insurgent. What I would say that is interesting that we found out here was we collected over 5,000 photos between over 3 years in 15 different communities. And this was by any means very successful as a citizen science project. But as insurgency, I feel that we needed to do a round of interviews. And that's what we map in this chapter. We interviewed how insurgent was actually this practice, or how insurgent could citizen science be in the future if we push the boundaries of the participatory into the insurgent. And this is the main summary of findings. We did interviews with the participants in the communities and with the field workers, mostly the people within the project, Indonesian and Fijian colleagues that worked with us over the years, to connect with people and to make sure that this data was working and to make sure that people's needs were being heard. They were the real insurgent planners here. And we found out that this project that was intended to collect data, it ended up being a platform for insurgent planning because it connected to local knowledge. It provided evidence that communities could then take over to the government to advocate for better conditions. And it also served as a model in which people could bond together and create stronger community linkages and mobilization platforms. So really, from establishing trust to aligning the project with needs, to creating information platforms between community members, this was really an interesting way that led to many outcomes that were not planned at the beginning. For example, when people were taking these photos of floods and putting it in a WhatsApp group, because that's basically what it was. We created a WhatsApp group that people could connect with each other. And by sending these photos, people started making connections and offering help to each other. And then even they created an informal early warning system, actually, because someone was upstream, and when it flooded upstream, people downstream started planning and moving things upstairs or helping neighbors prepare for disruption. So there was a lot that happened beyond citizen science that we very often don't see documented. And I believe that's the real contribution, is pushing us from the participatory, from the academic data collection into what else could be out there. What could we bring for a practice that is increasingly insurgent? Thank you very much for the opportunity to share. I'd love to continue the conversation later.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Erich. Thank you. And yeah, in Erich's, it's a contribution that we have in the book that speaks to the position of being in academia and academics and working with civil society groups, working with citizens. So also the representatives that we have here today, not only from a geographical spread, but also different positionalities in different institutions and different perspectives, but also from the different parts of the book itself. Thanks so much, Erich, for being able to come. We are grateful for knowing that it is not as disruptive in terms of time zones if you were in Singapore, but it's really good. Thank you. Right, so we're now moving to our final summary of the contributions, and we have Ying-Tu Lin from the University of Amsterdam with us. Thank you, Ying-Tu, for accepting the invitation and be able to join us. So her research touches extensively on urban public spaces, governance, and social impact. With her PhD dissertation, she explored the complexity of planning mixed-use public spaces with a governance lens, and this focused on spaces in Amsterdam, but also in Taipei, in Taiwan. So I understand that other side interests that she has include urban food systems and commons, urban playgrounds, childhood-friendly environments, and critical platform urbanism. Thanks so much, Ying-Tu. So please, now I'll hand over to you.
Thank you for having me. I would like to show some pictures. I believe, wait, Roberto, can you help me in sharing like some pictures? Because I think I don't have the right. So I'll start with it. So my name is Ying-Tu. I actually just finished my PhD. I'll start new position soon. So Thanks for having me also like in my in-between years. So today I'm talking about like me as an activist and as a researcher in this like urban playground movement in Taiwan. So in this project, we so essentially the movement is like probably the most popular urban social movement in Taiwan for over past 5 years. Essentially, it's about a group of middle-class professional moms and their kids, how they highlighting the right of play in the playground, in the parks, and get this idea popular. And then in between, in this specific book chapter, I look at how did they disrupt the system, but also establish a new governance tool to accommodate Play Street. So Play Street is might be quite common in the West European context, but in Taiwan, people are not very used to like play and street. So what does it mean? So the context is pretty simple. Like, can we go to the next slide? Thanks. The context is very simple. The context is we were trying to extend the right to play beyond parks and the playgrounds, because cities, especially densely developed area, could be very limited with green spaces. So we thought like, hey, like, what is the right to the city for kids? Oh, maybe they could play in a neighborhood street. So we started as a activism-led conversation to the public officials like, hey, can we do that? And then public officials, which at the beginning say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. But when we started to doing that, we realized there are all kinds of institutional limitations. For example, on law, it literally says it's forbidden to play on the street. And if you have this law on the table, all the other potential supporters say, no, you have to go talk to police, that we can't do things against the law. So the problem became how to find an institutional space that allow actions go around this law. And for that, in this case specifically, we grabbed the political moment to leverage powers, make things happen. So, which to answer the first question, this is the context, and it was led by activists, but involved civil planners, public officials, and politicians to collectively make this happen. So, if we can go to the next slide. So, what is it really? I think what makes the experience as insurgent planning practice is like, it's about institutionalized play as a thing on the street. So the impossibility of Play Street open up the space, like open up the fact that streets is a closed-off institutional system. There are all kinds of functions, people can run marathon, as mobility, as this and that, but hey, like all of a sudden, like a group of mom and kids say, hey, we want to play. So the showing up in itself is a disruption, but the aftermath of this disruption is actually a collaboration of creating this tool for kids to allow Play Street event to be able to establish on public space. So I think that's the main contribution, and it's also a transgressional planning in the sense that citizens took the initiative, and then professional planners, public officials, they follow up. So they offer their professional knowledge, collaborate with these citizens and these little kids to make things happen. So, in order to owning street, they have to disrupt the system to create this legitimacy of their right on the street. And if I'm trying to theorizing the insurgent planning practice, I would say this practice is more than the result that eventually there's a set of tools in the government that civil groups could apply for this Play Street event. But it's a process and result matters at the same time, in the sense it's a very Freirean pedagogical practice that when you do this with kids, when you involve different social groups in the process, people also got to know their right. They also got to know how to negotiate as a citizen. And it's a bittersweet to me to talk today, because I also see that the dynamic of this like insurgency and institutionalization is always that goes around the circle. So after this case that just happened last year, so the organization also divided into, at one point, part of people opt for becoming a politician and a more of a social enterprise organization. So they went to representative democracy, advocate for children's right to play. And the other activists, they remain on the position of direct democracy, in the sense that they're now, because of the Play Street, they're also involving the other part of work on human-centered mobility. And I think if there's any lesson for urban planners, I would say for urban planning paradigm, although planners often are kept within the institutions, but if the moment comes, I think we really need to grab the movement and serve the groove. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Intu. Thank you. And thank you for adding also another different perspective, and also from a range of different actors as well. In this case, as I mentioned before, it's not easy, for instance, for us to respond in the book what constitutes as an insurgent planning practice, but rather we have to understand the context and have a nuanced understanding of how actors engage and what it's seen as responding to hegemonic interests, and how these practices can be disruptive themselves. Right. Thanks so much for yeah.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to highlight the fact that we have very different contexts here. Christine's context is a context of exception of civil war in the past and constant political instability. And here with Intu, we have a very vibrant democracy. I have the feeling that Taiwan is a very vibrant democracy. And one of the contributions of this specific chapter was the notion that insurgency is quite fluid, because people were pretty much willing to comply with the rules and regulations of the city, but they were also willing to push the envelope when they needed to. So I think it was super interesting. But we were tremendously optimistic towards time. We are a bit late, 20 minutes late, but that's fine. If you stay with me for a little longer, we have Clarissa Freitas from the Federal University of Ceará, who is going to comment on the talks and the book, and to provide a synthesis and critical perspective on the presentations. We have Clarissa. She has been teaching urban design and urban planning since 2003. She has experience in urban and housing management, working for the Ministry of Cities in Brazil, the federal district government also in Brazil, and municipal governments. Her main research interests are informal urbanization, urban and environmental regulation, geographic information systems, and urban modeling. And I think that's quite a lot. She has been doing new things that are not in this mini bio. Well, Clarissa, the floor is yours.
Hi, Roberto and Gabriel and Professor Holston and everybody. This is a difficult task here. I have to say that I haven't read all the chapters presented, but I feel that I need to because they sound very interesting. And what I did was I tried to make a small comment on all of the chapters that were presented here. So I have been My scholarship is very influenced with the work of Professor Faranak Miraftab, who was my advisor. And I read closely the introduction of the book and how what she conceptualized as insurgent planning guided in some way this description of practices. And in the description of these 5 practices that we've heard here, there is something that rings the bell, you know, in what she, and for some time now, I too have been thinking about what is insurgent planning and the significance of insurgent planning. Just a second, I'm running out of battery in my computer. Okay, so let's do it. Starting from this last one, what I understand here and what I would highlight is, I think, closely to what Roberto Rocco has highlighted, which is the fluidity. I've written here the temporal aspect of it. In the introduction of the book, Professor Miraftab talks about her difficult position when people ask her, how do I become insurgent planning, or how do I hire insurgent planning? And her response is that there is no permanent position, there is no level of being insurgent planning. That's why we focus on practices and not on actors, which is what Gabriel have just reminded us also. So this last experience in Taipei, what it seems to tell us is that there has been a moment of insurgency with some conditions, because it was something that really bothers a lot of these actors. But it is not really a permanent position. And even in what the way that she has presented, it demonstrated us that is the point. So, but she also says something that happens that also I heard in the description of the other chapters, which is the power of bonding people together. You know, so most of these chapters, it seems that collectivity and this, I think we could call social capital, that we by us uniting people on a common cause, they are able to, they build some transformative power that is something that is not really planned. I mean, we haven't planned all that. And sometimes we get surprised when these things happen. So this was mentioned here, and it's also mentioned in other of the practices that were described. The previous practice, which is Erich Wolff's description on the RISE project, I am a little bit more familiar. We have had some interactions before. And I'm also a person that is very enthusiastic with the power of the data, even though I also share his impression that the power of data is really very much overrated. And what he brings us is actually, it meets with my experience here in Fortaleza. I'm an enthusiastic of data. And that's why I always put, you know, GIS on all my mini bios and all of that, because we always, as architects, we need spatial data. And in informal, precarious communities, we don't have those. And that is also a very different scenario from Europe and the United States, where you have, you know, much more data about everything. So, but what he's telling us is that it's not really the fact that we have data that is transformative, and not even the fact that it was the citizen who collected the data that is transformative. It's not really that. I mean, it's part of it. The data is important as evidence of the fact that the communities are suffering floods, but this is a small part of the insurgency. I mean, the biggest part is that the data was able to, again, create bonds with people. You know, people started talking about what they have discovered, and the data has just confirmed what they already knew. But it seems that the institutional power, you know, the powerful stakeholders would not listen to them if they didn't have data. and if they didn't have the support of a fancy international university or some of that. So I put myself very often in that position. It's just collecting data, but it's not for the sake of data. It's for the sake of empowering them and for them to be heard, because it's not the university to have to be heard. It's the citizens who are very vulnerable and don't feel that they have power to talk, and they are not listened by the institutional powers. So even though Professor Miraftab is not enthusiastic of data, and I know her in that point, but she says something that always also rings the bell here. What she says is that the importance of feelings and emotions is very underrated in the theory of transformative practices. So this dialogue that the collection of data was able to foster is not a rational thing that we are able to theorize. It's something that it's really, in some say it is irrational. It is just a shared feeling that those residents just realize that they have. So I think that, again, the power of dialogue and the bonds between people is something that it was transformative. That is what I heard. So the next one, going backwards, what I stressed, Roberto, please tell me how much time I have. Am I talking too much? Okay.
No. Sorry, we are late, but well, that's a fact of life. Just go on.
I think, yeah, I think 5 minutes or something. So the chapter about Beirut, what it rings the bell to me was the fact that it is closer to the global South situation. The context of Lebanon, of Beirut, the fact that we have no institutions to rely on. I mean, we have rules, but we don't follow the rules, because even the power, those who makes the rules, they break the rules themselves. So it's, of course, I understand Beirut is in a somewhat particular position in terms of context, but it's very familiar for us here from, observing the periphery of a peripheral city in Brazil, that rules is something that people just don't talk about because they don't have any kind of effect whatsoever. So, and I think, and what I like about the theory of insurgent planning is that it breaks the way that we were taught to look into, like, cities of the global north, to say, oh, they are planned. Now we have to be planned just like them. But this theory of insurgency, it helps us in understanding that we will not be able to improve if we copy those rules or those ways of planning, because our contexts are very different. So this perpetual state of exception, it's something that I would say defines the global South cities. And there are some theory on that of some, Southern scholars in this global dialogue that I think we should pay more attention to. Again, here in the case of Lebanon, I make some notes about how insurgent planning is not a permanent label, and how there is this temporal aspect of it. It was an aspect that I've heard in the description of the case of Beirut. In the case of Belgium, which is a very different case, from the scenario of Lebanon. And so it's a private practice in a global north situation, but even so, it has insurgencies. And that's why it makes me become much more curious about it. How are they able to do so? What called my attention was the fact that those people, those professionals, were able to activate imagination, which is also an aspect very important to insurgency. We have no transformation if we are not able to dream about this transformation, to dare to dream, to dare to design something that is not, that most, even architects that were trained to transform and to design the unimaginable, even those architects, I keep myself, I mean, my students very often tell me, oh, teacher, do you think I'll be able to design that? That's not possible. That is not realistic. And I say, what is architect if it's not to design unrealistic plans? You know, that is our role. And in this case, calls my attention to the fact that those planners had the ability to trigger this imagination. And also, you know, between this hard choice between cooperating and demonstrating conflict, emphasizing cooperation and emphasizing conflict, which is in Professor Faranak's theory, she conceptualized, you know, the notion of invited and invented spaces of dialogue, because she's always saying that it's not really just working in the inventing spaces, which is emphasizing conflict, and not of course, not only working under the invited spaces, which is on cooperating with states and institutions. So the real transformative power is when you are able to do both, you know, and when you are free to choose between, to bet, you know. So in this situation, I bet on making the conflict visible. In this situation, I think it is worth cooperating. So this position of being both within and outside of institutions, it's something that is also part of what we've been understanding as insurgents. And you know, it reminded me that somehow in what was presented. On the first case, on the case of Turkey, what I had some trouble in understanding. I think my sound was not very good back then, so I'm sorry about that. But what I wanted to specifically ask was how it seems that there is, not only in the first case, but probably in most cases, the role of the researcher, how the researcher has collaborated. I mean, the writer of the chapter has collaborated with the practice. We call here activist research, or in Brazil, we always say extensão universitária, né? Which is it's outreach, when the knowledge produced by the university goes outside the walls of the university and goes to society in order to transform something. So I wanted to listen a little bit more about what was the involvement of the authors of the chapter with the practice that were being described, because this is something that it takes us too much time, you know, to research and talk about those practices, because we feel ourselves that we can only write if we contribute somehow to the transformation of the situation that we are researching, and not making the situation and the circumstances a distant object of research. We position ourselves, we try to do that all the time, you know, position ourselves within the conflict. We contribute to the cause of those actors that we understand as the most vulnerable actors. And after contributing, we feel that, okay, now we can write and we can dialogue theoretically. So, I mean, that was something that the first case reminded me a little bit, you know, how all those researchers in some way contributed to even visibilize the conflict that is being described. I think that was it. I'm not sure if this is what you were expecting of me.
Absolutely. It was exactly what we were expecting. And I'm really sorry that we are a bit pressed for time. And maybe I made you rush, so sorry for that. But you said a lot of very core things to what we think. I have to make a public, I have to make a public confession, is that I use this book, this edition of the book, to learn about insurgent planning. When I set out to edit the book, I had a good understanding. I had read texts, but I think I didn't know enough. And after editing the book with Gabriel, I think now I know more. So I really recommend to people who are exploring a subject to really engage with people writing about it. But you highlighted the fluidity and the transience of being insurgent. Sometimes you are insurgent right now because you need to, but later on you get out of that insurgency state, you do something else, you negotiate, you cooperate, you are part of the institution many times, as there's even a chapter in our book of a very established planner. You highlighted something super nice, that is the support from universities and support from institutions, support from activist researchers like us, I think, who only feel validated to say something if they contribute. And I kind of agree with that, because otherwise it's not feasible. And the other thing you mentioned is the importance of feelings and emotions in transformative practices. And I think, well, I really recommend everyone to read Faranak's texts on hope as a political practice, because that converses with this idea that we need to access emotions of care, of sometimes of anger, and to be able to act, actually. Gabriel, I don't know if you want to say something, or...
No, that's fine. And as you said, I'm also concerned with the time, and also to leave some time to our participants who have stayed with us so far, and to open the floor to see if others have questions. I'm aware that Clarissa had put a question to Duygu directly, but I just wonder if you could make perhaps a round. Let's see if we have enough, and then we give space for each contributor to respond directly. So if you have a question, please post on the chat, or I think you also have the ability to just unmute yourself and ask directly. Okay, or we can give some time for people to think and leave and kickstart with Duygu, perhaps by answering directly to Clarissa. Thank you.
Sure. I was going to write in chat. Thank you so much, Professor. Sorry that you couldn't follow the entire presentation, but it was already a very compressed one. I am actually a board member of the chamber since I was a research assistant. I started this role when I was doing my master's degree. And up to today, for 12 years, I am still a member. Sometimes I drop the role and everything, but I cared this a lot because, you know, since I decided to be an academic, I wanted to also be on the side of actually in the practice as well, which is not so easy in the case of Turkey. And you mentioned when you were talking about the Beirut case, how the practices are very similar to Global South. In Turkey, I discussed this in my PhD thesis as well. Although geographically we are positioned in the Global South, the Global North, all the practices, planning practices are quite similar. This informality, especially the authorities trying to find their way around the very harshly put laws and legislation. So that's why I wanted to be a part of these practices, but we never actually named these practices as insurgent. After I see the call of the book, I thought of myself, I didn't know about this literature and what we are doing in the chamber, especially in the sense of some of the members, as Deniz, Typhoon, sometimes myself and other names. We are trying to find the ways around some laws and legislation, while the role of the chamber is actually work within the institution. So it has been not so easy to separate myself from this process, of course, because we were actively engaging as a part process during the time as well. And it has not been easy for us to get jobs or continue some positions either. So it was written from the heart, this chapter. And we try to position ourselves a bit far from the actual book chapter. But up to today, what we are doing, especially myself, is being directly involved with the chamber's activities while I'm an academic in the university. Until now, it didn't create so many problems other than small delays in, appointments and job, processes. But other than that, yeah, it's what it is. I hope it explained. It's a very complex and hard situation to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you for your clarification. I wonder if there are more questions also to Duygu and to others. I'm seeing that we are approaching 2 hours of event, so I'm afraid that quite a few people had to leave to other meetings because people have meetings all the time online nowadays. Well, if there are no more questions, I will share this recording with everyone later. So don't expect an email today, but I will send the presentation later to everyone. I think we also have the transcript. I will try to see if the transcript is clear enough to be shared with the permission of everyone. Of course, if you're not okay with sharing, please let me know. But we look forward to interacting with everyone further. There is a lot to be studied and discussed on insurgent planning, especially now, because we've just seen how the far right has advanced in the European elections, and everywhere in the world we are seeing a resurgence of far right politics. I think we need to counteract that with other kinds of narratives and other ideas about justice and participation and insurgence. Gabriel, do you want to say a few final words or?
Yeah, no, as final words, just to thank you, just to extend my thanks again for everyone who was able to come to attend and who stayed with us till this late. And also to thank you once again to our contributors, who've been amazing to have been patient with us with this project that took a little
for
while
many years
to conclude. Yeah,
for many years they have been patient. Yeah,
disrupted by the pandemic as well, but it's good to see that we reached this point to officially announce to the world, right? The book is here, the contributions are here as well. And finally, to thanks to Clarissa for being kindly accepting the invitation to comment on it, and also for your scholarship as well. You probably, when you have the time to look in more detail, you see many references there as well. So it's good to have you here and to be able to say a few words about the book and about the presentations as well. So that's all from me, Roberto. I think we can just wrap up here.
Yeah, it's all for me as well. I think we are all a bit tired. Thanks to our contributors. Thanks, Clarissa. Thanks to the audience, to those who stay there until the end. And you will hear from us, and maybe there is going to be more books about insurgent planning. Who knows, right? For now, thank you so much, and see you another time.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.